In this video we look at what Hitler thought about the Americans and the United States, because his views from the late 1930s were very positive, whereas during the war his opinion was quite different. So to get a better understanding we look at German primary sources and get commentary from the leading German expert on this topic, namely Dr. Klaus Schmider, who is a senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst since 1999. And in 2021 published his book about why Germany declared war on the United States. First off, we look at Hitler's unpublished manuscript on foreign policy from 1928. This manuscript is also sometimes called his second book, which many historians note is a rather unsuitable title. Currently in academia, it has the rather mundane title Foreign Policy Position after the June-July 1928 Reichstag election. Yet its content is far more interesting and spicier than the title might suggest. Dr. Schmider will give you now a brief overview why this document is so interesting.
Hitler's second book of 1928 is of crucial importance to understanding the evolution of his thoughts on the United States. First of all, there is the focus on foreign policy. Mein Kampf does have the odd reference on foreign policy issues, including those that have a bearing on Japan or the United States, but they are fairly infrequent. In the case of the second volume, it's basically a manuscript dedicated to foreign policy issues. Crucially also, in contrast to Mein Kampf, the second book was never redacted or edited with a view to having it published or translated. We know that in the case of Mein Kampf, this actually led to a number of quite significant alterations over the years. On the other hand, with the second book, we essentially get Hitler's thoughts straight from the horse's mouth. And here we have somebody, and this actually dovetails rather nicely with what he has to say on the same subject in private conversation and in articles and in a number of speeches, who admires the United States, who respects the United States, who sees in them an up-and-coming great power, superpower even, and this is the surprising bit, persists in this judgment even after the Great Depression hits. So basically his judgment in the second book actually stands the test of the Great Depression if we look at a number of articles and speeches and private conversations which he held and which are recorded from the early 1930s. So yes, the Great Depression hits, well, all industrialized nations badly. It hits the US particularly badly, but Hitler is still on record as late as 1932, when he has no reason in the world to basically cramp his style, or you could say eat his words in any way, as somebody who admires the US, not as you could say an expression of genuine fondness. He admires the US in the way that you could say somebody who respects strength, somebody who respects economic and military potential, admires a possible rival.
So let us take a closer look. Be aware that Hitler referred to the United States often as the Amerikanische Union, the American Union. One quote that stands out early is about the bleak future of the German nation in contrast to the American one. The prospects of the German people are bleak. Neither the present living space nor that achieved by a restoration of the borders of 1914 will permit us to lead a life analogous to that of the American people. If this were desired, either the soil of our people would have to be substantially enlarged, or the German economy would have to return to ways already familiar to us from the pre-war period. Unsurprisingly, the theme of living space is present throughout the whole chapter. The next parts are about the economy. Something that came up several times in the comments over the years is that Hitler underestimated the American industry. The question is how valid these statements are, since Hitler quite often mentioned the might of the US economy. Not only are we Germans, for example, unable to export even somewhat successfully against the American competition, despite our ridiculous wages, but we have to watch the American cars spreading alarmingly even in our own country. This is only possible because the size of the American domestic market, its wealth of purchasing power and raw materials, guarantees the American automobile industry domestic sale figures which alone make possible production methods that would simply be impossible in Europe because of the lack of these domestic sales possibilities. We are dealing here with the general motorization of the world, so a matter of unmeasurable future significance. What Hitler probably underestimated was the speed in which it might be ready for a total war. Alternatively, or additionally, he might have had a similar view as the Japanese leadership, that to a certain degree were motivated to declare war on the United States, because for the Japanese leadership it was not the best opportunity, but more or less the last chance before the window of opportunity for Japan to have a chance of winning the war at all would be completely closed. Of course, for Hitler the economy was just a means to an end. But the more a nation professes the belief that it can preserve its life by economically peaceful activity alone, the more its very economy itself is consigned to collapse. For finally, the economy, as a purely secondary matter in the life of nations, is bound to the primary existence of a powerful state. Before the plow must stand the sword, and before the economy, an army. The next parts are about the various statements made about the racial quality of the United States, and these are very different to his wartime statements. It is not by chance that the American Union is the state in which by far the most inventions, some of them incredibly daring, are being made at the present time. In contrast to old Europe, which has lost an infinite amount of its best blood through wars and emigration, Americanism stands as a young, racially selected people. After a short example on how unsuited it would be to compare the performance of 1,000 racially questionable Europeans with the abilities of 1,000 racially high-quality Americans, he continues. Only a consciously völkisch, which in this context means that certain races and groups would be excluded, racial policy could save the European nations from losing the law of action to America, as a result of the inferior value of the European peoples to that of America. Clearly indicating that he sees the United States as a threat in overall. He expands that the threat is particularly strong because the United States has adopted laws that exclude people from immigrating into the states that don't fulfill certain physical and racial criteria, whereas in Europe no such measures were taken, and as such Europe would bleed dry of its best people. This refers to the US Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration far more than before. It was more or less active until 1965. Thank you for Andrew for this addition. He specifically notes in one paragraph that the strength of the United States is not solely due to its size. Be aware that the numbers in this quotes are missing since they were missing in the original as well. That the American Union is able to rise to a threatening height is not due to the fact that millions of people form a state there, but to the fact that millions of square miles of the most fertile and richest soils are inhabited by millions of people of the highest racial value. This view is later expanded on, namely that the United States managed to create a new young ethnic group by mixing different ethnic groups from Europe. His views were likely influenced by the American book The Passing of the Great Race from 1916. It was very popular in the United States in the 1920s, and we know that it was gifted to Hitler. In the mid-1920s, the Munich publisher Lehmann, who was probably the greatest preferrer of racist literature, sent Hitler the well-known American book by Madison Grant titled The Passing of the Great Race, claiming that the Nordic gene pool in America was being diluted by inferior blood. There's good reason to believe that Hitler carefully read this and other books sent to him by Lehmann. Yet Hitler also mentioned social aspects positively in the United States. For instance, he wrote in Mein Kampf, "If in recent decades the wealth of significant inventions has increased extraordinarily, especially in North America, it is not least because many more talents from the lowest classes find the opportunity of higher education there than is the case in Europe." Now let us look at the various statements made about the United States and Americans throughout the war. These are far more negative and are more well known, yet they are generally also from weaker source material, meaning often second-hand accounts what Hitler said, whereas the previous documents were written by him. The author Klaus Fischer suggests that Hitler's view about America changed around the mid-30s when US policy started to interfere with his expansion in Europe. Now Dr. Schmider will note what in his opinion likely changed Hitler's views.
It is impossible to deny that Hitler's views on the United States, especially as articulated to a public or semi-public audience, start to shift. First, in 1941, in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, but then in a really major way as both countries are at war. This is not necessarily a contradiction to what was said earlier. In a way, his policies have become a self-fulfilling prophecy. He now finds himself at war with the US, but crucially, as he is realizing by the last week of December 1941, the Soviet Union is not paralyzed, and any plans he had to restructure the German war economy with the view to fighting an air and naval war against the Western powers will have to be dropped, because the army in the East has to be rebuilt almost from scratch. In short, he starts to realize gradually that he may well have perpetrated a game-changing blunder. So aspersions uttered against the American nation, the American people, the supposed fighting proficiency of the American armed forces as the war progresses, can very much be likened to the case of a small child whistling to itself in a dark forest. This is essentially a process which will take some time. It is punctuated by ups and downs. The German armed forces in the field continue to be successful, and he has reason to assume that essentially he may still pull it off regardless. But this becomes more and more infrequent. There are, in fact, 3 statements from the turn of the years 41-42, where he all but says, we may well have lost the war, or the Americans are the ones who will bring home the roost. This is because for several days around Christmas and New Year 41-42, it really looks like Army Group Center might just collapse. Not just stand still fighting the Russians, but actually collapse as a fighting unit, and his spirits are at an all-time low. Now, when we consider that he just declared war on the US in ignorance of essentially these events that would just transpire a couple of weeks later, his morale hits rock bottom. And the only way still open to him to make this state of affairs seem palatable to his audience, listeners, hangers-on at Führer's headquarters, is by disparaging the American nation.
First, we look at notes from 2 diaries. The following is from the situation assessment by Hitler from 20th January 1941. Although important here, it was done in front of Mussolini, the Italian Foreign Minister Siano, and 3 Italian generals. This means the assessment was very likely adapted towards the Italian leadership, hence US capabilities were likely downplayed. From America, even if it enters the war, I don't see a great danger. The greater one is the huge bloc of Russia. We have very favorable political and economic treaties with Russia, but I prefer to rely on my means of power. Strictly speaking, at this point in time, the US would not have been a major threat, since it would still need some time to get the war machine going. Remember that in the 1920s Hitler wrote about the economic power of the US. As such, he likely had no illusions about it, although he might have underestimated how fast it could be turned into bruising weapons. This seems to be underlined by Jonas Halder's diary entry about Hitler's talk to his generals on 30th March 1941. He wrote, "England is pinning its hopes on America and Russia. Peak performance not for 4 years. Russia's transportation problems." Then there is of course the declaration of war by Hitler against the United States from 11th December 1941. Here he noted, "Franklin Roosevelt took over a state with a decaying economy as a result of democratic influences, and I took the helm of an empire that was also on the verge of complete ruin thanks to democracy. The United States had 30 million unemployed, Germany 7 million, and 7 million short-time workers. In both countries, public finances were in ruins. While in the German Reich, under the National Socialist leadership, in a few years a tremendous rise of life, economy, culture, art, etc. had begun, President Roosevelt had not succeeded in bringing about even the slightest improvements in his own country." Note that before that Hitler noted that Roosevelt is the main culprit, Hauptschuldige. Later on, Hitler notes that Roosevelt used any chance to get involved into a conflict to detract from his disjointed economic policy. Considering that Hitler wrote in the 1920s that the economy was just a means to an end, as previously stated, his statement is not without a certain irony. By the way, for a dedicated video on why Hitler declared war on the United States, see this video. The next source is a bit more problematic than the previous ones, namely Hitler's monologues in the Führer headquarters from 1941 to 1944, often also called table talks. This is complicated since there are various different versions of these monologues, particularly the non-German versions are an issue. So keep this in mind that there are different table talks. The German version edited by Werner Jochmann seems to be one of the more trusted versions, and various parts of it are verified by other sources as well. Still, as always, take everything with a grain of salt. In January 1942, he noted that America in its complete mental attitude has succumbed to a half-Jewish and half-black society. Additionally, he notes, "The reason I don't trust the Americans with a very good future is because they are, in my eyes, a depraved and corrupt state." For late August 1942, the following part is noted. "The Americans are an unpredictable lot. When the going gets tough, the English are much braver than the Americans. No comparison at all. Where do the Americans get off accusing the English of anything?" For June 1943 we have this record. "Our people have a strong feeling for romance which the American lacks completely because he never looks beyond the sea of houses in his skyscrapers. Our feeling for romance stems from the strong sense of nature that we Germans have." An interesting aspect here is that Hitler seems to have a rather stereotypical view about the United States, whereas in his writings he had looked at geo-economic factors and laws. This is also noted by the author Klaus Fischer, that writes about Hitler's split image about America. As such, it appears that there was a difference between Hitler's personal and professional views. As a final note, keep in mind that one of Hitler's trains was named Amerika, and only in 1943 the name was changed to Brandenburg. To conclude, the sources we looked at in this video show a stark contrast. Although we must keep in mind that we are comparing Hitler's writing from 1928 with statements he supposedly made in the 1940s, something that might explain the major differences. In 1928 he saw the United States to a certain degree as a role model, but also as a major threat. Most interestingly, and in stark contrast to the wartime statements, he assessed the United States as a country with a strong racial disposition, whereas during the war he made very negative remarks along these lines. Of course, one could argue that a lot had changed, or that Hitler got new information about the United States and changed his opinion. Of particular interest here is something Andrew noted, namely that in the 1920s the US helped Germany by providing loans, and also organized deals with the Dawes Plan that favored Germany. Meanwhile, the Smoot-Hawley tariff from 1930 had a bad effect on Germany's export-based economy. Additionally, we should not forget that Hitler had a tendency to change his moods and also opinions to a large extent, basically doing a 180-degree turn, often going from euphoric to very pessimistic. Furthermore, as stated by Schmider, the views from the late 1920s were very likely less affected, since at the time Hitler was not in a major position, had not run into any problems with the United States, and probably was also less affected by his success of domestic and wartime victories as well. We should not forget that he went from a small politician to basically the de facto ruler of Europe in less than 15 years. After all, keep in mind that Germany was not able to defeat France in the First World War, whereas in the Second World War it was done in mere 6 weeks. So Hitler likely was far less receptive to critique and new information. Another part might also have been that Hitler, knowing about the strengths of the United States, tried to convince his audience, and or maybe himself, about Germany's chances to defeat the United States even against these major odds. This would also be in line with his 1928 views, where he noted that the size of the US and its population was not the only factor, but the United States was inhabited by a large amount of people of the highest racial value. By then denying this racial value, he might have tried to fool himself. Big thank you to Dr. Schmider, thank you to the Sandhurst Library and its staff for hosting this interview, thanks to Military Aviation History for recording it, thank you to Andrew for the review and additional remarks. Thank you for watching and see you next time.